My son-in-law Tristan squandered my entire $800,000 pension fund, the savings from 37 years of teaching, and fled with his mistress, leaving my daughter heartbroken and our home in ruins. I was in utter despair until my grandson Cody whispered, "Grandpa, I fixed everything." 2 days later, the phone rang and he was screaming in panic, begging for mercy he wouldn't get. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel as this one will soon be closing. You will find a link to the new channel in the description of this video in the pinned comment, or you can simply click on the subscribe button and select the second channel. My name is Russell Fleming. I am 72 years old, and I live alone in a one-story house on Cactus Wren Drive in Scottsdale, Arizona. The house is modest, about 1800 square ft, with a workshop in the back where I restore old books and a garage that holds my truck and a fly rod I keep ready at all times. 37 years I spent teaching English and coaching track at schools across Maricopa County before I retired. People ask me what I miss most about teaching. Honestly, I miss the moment a student finally understands something they thought was beyond them that looked pure and unguarded. I spent nearly 4 decades collecting those moments like pressed flowers. What I did not miss was the politics, the paperwork, or the faculty meetings that could have been a memo. I am a patient man by nature, quiet by habit, and precise by training. I taught kids to read between the lines. I believed genuinely and without irony that a careful reader could not be fooled. I was about to learn just how expensive that kind of confidence could be. Tristan Hall walked into my daughter Carol's life 9 years ago at a financial planning conference in Phoenix. Carol, my daughter, is 44 now and has her mother's stubbornness and her father's tendency to trust too easily. "Dad, I think this one is different." Dad, I think this one is different. She was right, though not in the way either of us hoped. Tristan was 41, trim, well-dressed, with a kind of easy confidence that fills a room without shouting. He had a FINRA 65 license and his own independent financial consulting practice on Scottsdale Road. He golfed. He ordered wine by the vineyard. He remembered birthdays and brought good whiskey to Thanksgiving. I liked him. That is the part that still sits in my chest, like a splinter I cannot quite reach. 3 years ago, during a Sunday dinner at Carol and Tristan's rental on Hayden Road, he brought up the subject of my retirement account, with the kind of casual ease that, in hindsight, should have been its own warning signal. He mentioned that my existing fund manager was conservative to the point of negligence, which was not entirely wrong. He laid out a proposal that was calm, detailed, and reasonable sounding. Consolidate the portfolio under his management. Increase the yield. Simplify the oversight. $800,000. 7 years of early mornings. Standardized tests and teenagers who thought Julius Caesar was a salad. I signed the transfer documents 2 weeks later. I trusted him. He was family. That word family, I'm learning, can be used as a lock or as a key depending entirely on who holds it. The 14th of February arrived like any other winter day in Scottsdale, which means it was 63 degrees and the sky was the kind of blue that makes people move here from Cleveland. I had planned to drive over to Carol's place for dinner, nothing formal, just the two of us, since Tristan had mentioned a client event. I pulled up to the house on Hayden Road around 6 and knew immediately that something was wrong. The front window that usually showed the glow of the kitchen light was dark. One of Carol's cars was in the driveway, but the space where Tristan parked his BMW was empty. Carol answered the door before I knocked. She was still in her work clothes, arms wrapped around herself, eyes red, and fixed somewhere past my shoulder. I stepped inside. The living room was half empty. The large, sectional sofa was gone. The television mount on the wall held nothing. The built-in shelves that Tristan had filled with framed photos and decorative items had been stripped clean. There were pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung like outlines of things that used to exist. "He's not answering," Carol said. Her voice had the flat quality of someone who has been crying for long enough that the feeling had gone somewhere deeper than tears. I came home, and it was like this. His closet is empty, his laptop, his golf bag. There was a note on the kitchen counter folded once. I read it standing there in my coat. It was 8 sentences long. No apology, no explanation that meant anything. The last line said, "I need you to understand that this was not a decision I made lightly." I folded the note back along its crease and set it down exactly where I found it. I tried Tristan's number 3 times while Carol sat at the kitchen table and stared at the bare wall straight to voicemail, each time with the familiar recorded greeting that now sounded like a small, well-rehearsed performance. I made Carol a cup of tea she did not drink. I checked whether any of the utilities were still running. They were for now. Then I sat down across from my daughter and thought about the $800,000 I had placed in Tristan Hall's hands. I opened the banking app on my phone. I had not checked the retirement account in several weeks because there had been no reason to. Tristan sent quarterly summaries that looked professional and showed steady, unremarkable growth, the kind of growth that does not excite you, which is precisely the kind that does not alarm you either. I navigated to the account, waited for the screen to load, and looked at the balance. The number on the screen was 0. Not low, not reduced, not a pending transfer with an explanation attached. 0 followed by 2 decimal places that confirmed the 0 with the quiet certainty of a door closing from the other side. I have stood in front of classrooms for nearly 4 decades and watched students encounter a number that did not make sense to them. Their faces go very still for a moment before the emotion catches up. I imagine I looked something like that sitting at Carol's kitchen table with my phone in my hand. I did not say anything. Carol was watching me, and when she saw my expression, she set down her mug and said very quietly, "Dad, how bad is it?" "Bad," I said. That was all I gave her right then because she had enough to carry, and because I needed to think before I spoke. The next morning we sat down together and began tracing what had happened. Carol had access to some of the household financial records, and what we pieced together over 2 hours was methodical and cold. Tristan had moved the money in increments somewhere between $18,000 and $45,000 at a time, spread across 7 months, small enough amounts that the automated alerts I had set up never triggered. Someone who understood banking thresholds had done this deliberately and patiently. I thought about the man who remembered birthdays and knew which fork to use at a formal dinner, and I understood that the patience I was looking at was not new. It had been there the whole time, aimed at something I had not seen. I drove to his office on Scottsdale Road that same morning. Suite 215th floor, a business address with a professional directory listing and a glass door with the firm's name in clean sans serif lettering. The door was unlocked because the building manager had already opened it. Inside there was nothing. No desk, no computer, no files, no client certificates on the walls. One plastic chair in the corner that likely belonged to the building. The property manager, a heavy-set man in his 50s who smelled like coffee and irritation, told me Tristan had not paid February's rent and had not responded to 3 messages. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has had this conversation before and does not enjoy it. "You family?" he asked. "I was," I said. That afternoon, Carol called me crying in a way she had not done since her mother passed and told me something she had been holding for 6 months. She had noticed the late returns home, the private phone calls taken outside, the sudden business trips that did not quite line up with what she knew of his client's schedule. Tristan had told her he was in negotiations with a significant new client, someone who required confidentiality. Carol believed him because she had wanted to, and because the alternative required a kind of courage she had not yet found. I did not tell her that was wrong of her. I told her she was not the one who should be ashamed. That evening I drove out to the Salt River not to fish. I keep the rod in the truck as a matter of habit, but I left it there and walked to the bank and stood in the cold air, listening to the water move over the rocks. I have made most of the significant decisions of my life near moving water. There is something about the sound that makes it easier to think without flinching. I thought about the police report I would file the next morning, which was the correct and necessary thing to do. I thought about the fact that criminal proceedings, while satisfying in a theoretical sense, tend to move with the urgency of a glacier and return money with about the same reliability. $800,000 does not wait for a prosecutor's docket. I thought about Tristan standing in that kitchen 9 years ago, shaking my hand and calling me by name in a way that felt like respect. I thought about the patience it takes to deceive someone who taught careful reading for 37 years. I thought about what a careful reader actually does when he finally finds the lie hidden in the text. A careful reader does not close the book. He goes back to the beginning and reads it again, slower, knowing what to look for. I stood there until the air got cold enough to mean it. And then I walked back to the truck. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the kind that wants to shout. It had compressed into something quieter and considerably more useful. I have seen students transform like that. The ones who fail a first test and come back the second time with a different look in their eyes. Not desperation, precision. I drove home, made coffee, and sat at my desk in the workshop for an hour with a legal pad and a pen. By the time I was done, I had 2 columns, what I knew and what I needed to find out. The second column was longer, but it was not unmanageable. I had dealt with longer reading lists. Then I picked up my phone and called my grandson, Cody Carroll's son, 18 years old and a first-year computer science student at Arizona State. The boy is quiet the way deep water is quiet, and he has a mind that sees patterns in things other people treat as background noise. He answered on the second ring. "Granddad," he said. "Cody," I said, "I need your help." The Scottsdale Police Department on Miller Road is a clean, well-lit building that processes financial complaints with the same quiet efficiency it applies to everything else, which is to say thoroughly and without any particular hurry. I arrived at 80 inches the morning 2 days after standing on the bank of the Salt River deciding what kind of man I was going to be about this. The officer who took my report was courteous, professional, and approximately 30 years old, which meant he had been in elementary school when I was teaching seniors to analyze unreliable narrators. I found that mildly amusing in a way I kept entirely to myself. I laid out the facts in order. Tristan Hall, Series 65 license, $800,000 transferred over 7 months in increments, designed to avoid triggering alerts. Empty office, empty account, a note on the kitchen counter with no apology worth the paper it occupied. The officer typed as I spoke, asked clarifying questions without interrupting the sequence, and told me that financial fraud of this scale would be referred to the detective division. He gave me a case number, a direct contact, and the reasonable expectation that I would not hear anything substantive for several weeks. I thanked him and meant it. The report needed to exist. The clock needed to start. But I had no illusions about what a criminal investigation would return to me or when. From the police station, I drove directly to the FINRA complaint portal, which I had already navigated the night before on my laptop in the workshop. Filing a complaint against a Series 65L for misappropriation of client funds is straightforward, and the form itself is designed for people who know exactly what happened to them. I submitted the documentation I had, account statements showing the transfers, Tristan's licensing information, the timeline Cody and I had reconstructed from the bank records Carroll pulled from the household files. FINRA would move at its own pace, but a suspended license meant Tristan could not operate legally in this industry again. That was not justice exactly. That was blocking one of the exits. 2 days before all of this, I had searched the AVO attorney directory, using terms that left nothing to interpretation: financial fraud, asset recovery, Scottsdale, Arizona. The name Virginia Perez appeared 3 times in the results before I stopped scrolling. 48 years old. 14 years specializing in civil financial fraud and asset recovery claims office on Thomas Road. Her reviews used words like methodical and relentless, which are 2 of the finest compliments a person can receive. I called her office that afternoon and scheduled a consultation for the following Thursday. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled faintly of printer, toner, and ambition. Virginia Perez met me at the door herself, which I noted. She was compact and direct, with the manner of someone who had sat across from a great many people in a great deal of distress and had learned to separate the useful facts from the emotional noise without being unkind about it. We sat down and I presented my legal pad, both columns. She read without interrupting. When she finished, she set the pad on the desk and looked at me steadily. "Mr. Fleming," she said, "if you are prepared to be patient, we have a real chance here. I spent 37 years grading essays written by people who thought patience was optional," I said. "I am comfortable with patience." She almost smiled. She explained the civil route with the same clean logic I used to appreciate in a well-structured essay. If Tristan had left any assets registered in Arizona, corporate accounts, vehicles, real property, anything attached to his name or to entities he controlled, a civil fraud claim could reach them. More urgently, she could petition the Maricopa County Superior Court for a temporary restraining order to freeze those assets immediately before Tristan had the opportunity to move whatever remained. A TTRO hearing could be scheduled within days. She did not need Tristan present. She needed evidence, and I had brought her a legal pad full of it. The transfers were deliberate and structured, she said, tapping the timeline I had written out. That is not sloppy accounting. That is intent. The court will see that. She would file the civil fraud claim that week. In the meantime, she needed anything I had on Tristan's corporate history in Arizona. That was where Cody came in. My grandson had been working for 3 days by the time I sat in Virginia Perez's office. And when I say working, I mean the kind of focused, silent work that looks from the outside like a young man staring at a laptop and occasionally drinking cold coffee. He had started with the Arizona Corporation Commission's public database, which is freely accessible and contains every registered LLC in the state. He searched variations of Tristan's name, his middle name, his mother's maiden name, the name of his old firm. Then he moved to Nevada and Florida, both states with flexible LLC registration rules that attract people who prefer their business structures opaque. He told me he was using open public registries and something called OSINT methodology, which stands for open source intelligence, meaning he was reading what anyone could read, just faster and with better questions. On the third evening he called me. His voice had the particular flatness of someone trying to sound casual about something that was not casual at all. "Granddad," he said, "I found 2 companies, both registered about 13 months ago. Both listing registered agents that are not Tristan by name, but the contact addresses and formation dates connect back to a pattern. One is in Nevada, one is in Florida. I can walk you through the documentation if you want, but the short version is that these were set up before he started moving your money." I sat with that for a moment. 13 months ago, Tristan had been sitting at my Thanksgiving table cutting turkey and asking about my latest Salt River trip. He had been building scaffolding for his exit while passing the cranberry sauce. "Both companies," I said. "Are they still active?" "That is the thing," Cody said. I could hear him typing. "The Nevada one shows as active." And Granddad. "The Nevada company has a UCC filing that references a commercial bank account opened in the same quarter it was registered." I wrote down the company names, the filing numbers, the registration dates. I wrote down everything Cody read to me the way I used to write down everything a student said when they finally started answering the question I had been waiting 3 weeks for them to answer. "Is the account still active?" I asked. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "Based on the filing status," Cody said carefully, "the account has not been reported as closed." I looked at the 2 columns on my legal pad. The second column was getting shorter. Virginia Perez did not react the way most people react when you hand them something useful. She did not exclaim or lean forward with sudden enthusiasm. She read the information Cody had compiled, the company names, the registration filings, the UCCC records, and she made 3 small notations in the margin of her own legal pad in handwriting, so precise it looked typeset. Then she looked up and said, "This is workable." I had learned in 2 meetings with Virginia Perez that workable was about as effusive as she got. I decided to take it as high praise. She explained the next step with the directness I had come to expect from her. The 2 shell companies Cody had identified could be added to the civil fraud claim as entities through which Tristan had moved misappropriated funds. The Nevada LLC with the active bank account was particularly significant under Arizona civil procedure. She could argue that assets held in entities Tristan controlled even indirectly and under other names were subject to the TTRO because they represented proceeds of fraud. She filed the amended complaint the following morning and requested an emergency hearing on the restraining order. The Maricopa County Superior Court scheduled the TTRO hearing for 4 days later. I sat in the back of the courtroom in my good jacket and watched Virginia Perez present a timeline that was, I had to admit, considerably clearer and more devastating than anything I could have assembled alone. She had taken my legal pad, Cody's research, the bank records Carol had pulled, and the police case number, and she had built something that moved with the logic of a closing argument in a case that had not yet gone to trial. The opposing counsel was absent because Tristan was absent because Tristan was somewhere that was not Arizona. The judge reviewed the documentation for 11 minutes and signed the order. The temporary restraining order froze all corporate accounts linked to Tristan Hall's identified entities. The total held was $127,400. I sat in that courtroom and did the arithmetic I had been avoiding. $800. 000 taken. $127. 400 frozen. $672. 600 still unaccounted for. It was not a victory. It was a foothold. But a foothold is where you begin. And I had spent enough time coaching young athletes to know that beginners who dismiss small gains tend to remain beginners. Perez met me in the hallway outside the courtroom after the ruling. "First money is always the hardest to get the court to touch," she said. "They tend to move faster after the first one." I told her I appreciated the perspective. That afternoon I made a different kind of appointment. I had looked up licensed private investigators in the Phoenix metro area, specifically those with law enforcement backgrounds and experience in financial fraud cases. The name that kept appearing in credible contexts was Harlan Watts, 55 years old, formerly a detective with the Phoenix Police Department, now licensed independently in Arizona. His website was plain to the point of austerity, which I considered a mark in his favor. I had known too many people who advertised heavily to compensate for delivering lightly. I drove to his office in central Scottsdale, a ground-floor suite in a building that also housed a tax preparer and a physical therapy practice. Harlan Watts was a broad-shouldered man who carried himself with the comfortable stillness of someone who had learned long ago how to wait without fidgeting. He shook my hand with the kind of grip that measures nothing because it has nothing to prove. I told him the situation in the same order I had told the police officer in Virginia Perez, because a clean sequence of facts is more useful than an emotional summary in any room. He listened without writing anything down, which I noticed. He asked 4 questions when I finished. 2 of them were about Tristan's professional network. One was about Nicole Ramirez, whose name Carol had found on a phone bill 6 weeks before the disappearance. And one was about whether I had any documentation of Tristan's travel history. I answered what I could and told him what I did not have. He nodded at both with equal evenness. 4500 for the first 2 weeks, he said. After that, we reassess what we have and where it's going. I wrote him a check. He said he would start that day. I believed him because people who ask precise questions at intake tend to do precise work in the field. Within 10 days, Harlan Watts had established through a combination of airline passenger manifests available through legal data brokers, credit activities showing up in public court filings in other jurisdictions, and social media accounts that had not been locked down, that Tristan Hall and Nicole Ramirez were in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. He sent me a summary document that was 3 pages long and contained no unnecessary words. I read it at my workbench at 11 at night with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. Cody came by the next afternoon, which he had started doing with the quiet regularity of someone who wanted to be useful but was too careful to say so directly. He had been looking at Nicole's social media presence, her main account, which was publicly visible and apparently unconsidered in its details. She had posted photographs not of faces or locations labeled directly, but with metadata and incidental background details that Cody, who spent his recreational hours competing in cybersecurity challenges, read the way I read a student essay, looking not at what was shown but at what was revealed. Without intention, he identified the hotel from a logo on a pool towel visible in the background of one image cross, referenced against resort properties in Puerto Vallarta, and confirmed it against a public check-in tag Nicole had used 4 days earlier. Una separate platform. I looked at the name of the hotel on Cody's screen and wrote it in my second column. That column, I noted, had been getting considerably shorter, but one detail kept circling in my mind, the kind of detail that a careful reader flags and returns to. Harlan Watts's report noted that Tristan Hall had not deactivated his American phone number. A man who had planned his exit for over a year, who had moved $800 0 inches careful threshold, avoiding increments across 7 months, had kept his United States phone number active from Mexican Beach Resort. That was not carelessness. That was an intention. A man keeps a line open because he expects to use it. A man who expects to return to the United States, and who has avoided Scottsdale, Phoenix, and Maricopa County entirely, is not hiding from America. He is choosing his re-entry point. I sat with that thought at the Salt River the following morning, rod in hand this time, because thinking goes better when the hands have something to do. And I watched the water and considered the geography of what Tristan Hall believed he was escaping to. He was not done with the country. He was done with this corner of it. The question that settled over the water like the early mist was not whether he was coming back. It was where he intended to land. Harlan Watts called me on a Tuesday morning while I was in the workshop sanding the spine of a water-damaged Steinbeck. I'd been coaxing back to respectability for 3 weeks. When the phone rang, I set the sandpaper down and answered it because Harlan Watts did not call to chat. "Fleming," he said. "Nicole Ramirez has a storage unit in Tempe facility on Broadway Road. Unit registered in her name. Monthly rental, still pulling, from an American debit card. She has been paying it automatically since last September." I set down the Steinbeck entirely. "What is in it?" "Personal property based on the rental agreement category she selected. Furniture, household goods, personal effects." She left in a hurry, and apparently did not want to deal with whatever is in that unit before she left. He paused the way he always paused before the part that mattered. The card it is charging is still active. She has not canceled the account or redirected the billing. A woman who helped plan a 2-year scheme to move $800,000 across a series of shell accounts had been paying $22 a month to store her belongings in Tempe because canceling an automatic payment required one phone call she had not gotten around to making. I did not feel particularly triumphant about that. I mostly felt tired in the way that tiredness comes when you realize the people who upended your life were not brilliant. They were just willing. I called Virginia Perez before Harlan was off the line. Perez listened to the storage unit information in her characteristic silence, and when I finished, she said, "Give me the facility, name the unit number and whatever documentation Watts has on the rental agreement." He is sending it now. Good. I will file a motion to attach the contents as assets connected to the fraud. If the unit holds property acquired with misappropriated funds, the court can treat it the same way it treats a bank account. She was already typing. I could hear it in the background. It will not take long. This is straightforward enough that the motion should be heard within the week. I appreciated Virginia Perez because she treated legal maneuvers the way I used to treat lesson planning. You identified the objective, you identified the obstacles, and you built the path between them without decorating it with drama. She did not tell me this was exciting. She told me it was straightforward. Coming from her, that was better. I was still at my workbench that afternoon when Harlan called a second time. That was unusual enough that I answered before it finished the first ring. There is something else, he said, the BMW X5 2022 model that Tristan Hall listed on his financial disclosure 3 years ago. It transferred title 3 weeks before he disappeared. I waited. It is currently registered to a woman in Tucson. Her name is Patricia Hall. She is 68 years old. Tristan's mother. I had met Patricia Hall twice. Once at the wedding where she had worn a pale lavender dress and cried at appropriate moments. Once at a Christmas dinner 4 years ago where she had praised Tristan's career with the serene confidence of a woman who believed her son was exceptional and had decided to keep believing it regardless of available evidence. She struck me then as someone who had never developed the habit of looking directly at something she would prefer not to see. A 68-year-old woman in Tucson was now the registered owner of a $68,000 vehicle that her son had transferred to her name precisely 23 days before vanishing to Mexico with money that was not his. I wrote that number in my second column. Then I called Perez again. "I know," she said when I started to explain. "Watts copied me on the title search. I've already pulled the transfer record. The date places it squarely within the pre-flight preparation window." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I'm adding Patricia Hall to the complaint as a third party defendant. Arizona law allows us to reach assets transferred to avoid creditors if the transfer was made while the debtor knew a claim was pending or likely. 3 weeks before a planned disappearance with $800,000 is going to be a difficult timeline for anyone to characterize as coincidental. I tried to feel something uncomplicated about that. Patricia Hall had not stolen anything from me. She had accepted a title document from her son without, I assumed, fully understanding what she was holding, but she had accepted it, and the asset was traceable. In a case built on traceable assets, sentiment was a column I could not afford to add. Carol called me that evening. She had been going through the house on Hayden Road systematically the way people sometimes do when the alternative is sitting still with the understanding of what has happened to them. She was sorting documents, financial statements, tax filings, insurance records, anything that bore Tristan's name or signature. She said she needed something to do with her hands. I understood that precisely. "Dad," she said. Her voice had changed over the past week and a half. The shattered quality was still there underneath, but above it there was something steadier, something she had found by watching me move through this without breaking. She was her mother's daughter, and she was also mine. And I had been waiting quietly for that second part to reassert itself. I found another box. It was in the back of the closet in his office, pushed behind the tax files. "Bring everything to Perez," I said. "I'm going to, but Dad, I looked through it first." She stopped for a moment. "There is a bank statement in here. It is not one of ours. The account name is Nicole Ramirez." I sat down on the stool at my workbench. The Steinbeck was still open in front of me. Spine half. Repaired waiting. How much, I said. The statement shows a transfer in. Carol's voice was careful and precise in the way that voices become when they are carrying something very heavy in a very controlled manner. $214,000. The date on the transfer is 3 days before he left. I looked at the 2 columns on my legal pad. I did not add anything to either one. I just sat there with the weight of that number and the understanding of what it meant. $214,000 moved to Nicole Ramirez 3 days before Valentine's Day. Not into a shell company. Not into an offshore account with 4 layers of insulation. Into an account in her name. Either Tristan had trusted her completely, or he had been careless in a way that all the careful planning in the world cannot always prevent. Either way, the money had a name on it now, and a name on a bank account is considerably easier to follow than a name on a shell company registered in Nevada. I told Carol to bring the documents to Perez first thing in the morning and to touch nothing else in that closet until she did. Then I sat alone in my workshop for a while with a cold cup of coffee, and the quiet understanding that the second column of my legal pad had just gotten a great deal shorter. I did not sleep particularly well that night. $214.0 Nicole Ramirez's account, 3 days before the disappearance. The number kept returning the way a poorly argued thesis returns when you are trying to grade past it. It was not the largest single piece of the missing money, but it was the most nakedly documented. A paper statement printed on standard paper left in a cardboard box behind tax files in a closet that Tristan had apparently considered inaccessible enough to abandon rather than take. The 41 years old. A Series 65 license. 2 years of methodical planning. And he had left a printed bank statement in his own home. I had a theory about that. People who are very confident in their plans tend to grow careless about their records because they stop imagining the moment when someone will be reading them. Virginia Perez reviewed the statement the morning Carol brought it in and called me before noon. Her voice had the particular quality it took on when something had changed the shape of the case. Not excited, recalibrated. This is direct evidence of a pre-flight transfer to a co-conspirator, she said. It strengthens the argument that Nicole Ramirez is not incidental to the fraud, but central to it. I am amending the complaint again. I will seek a freeze on her accounts based on this document. Can you reach a Mexican account from here? I asked if it stayed there. No. But $214,000 moved 3 days before departure may not have stayed anywhere for long. The question is whether any portion of it touched an American account, a card, a platform, anything with domestic nexus. Watts is running that now. I thanked her and hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking out at the backyard where the Palo Verde tree was starting to show yellow and the morning was still cool enough to mean something. Then I drove to the meeting she had scheduled, sat across from her for 90 minutes going through the amended complaint, and drove home feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from holding a great deal of information in careful order for a long time. When I opened my front door, Cody was sitting at my kitchen table with his laptop open and a half-empty glass of orange juice beside it, which meant he had let himself in with the spare key I had given him 3 weeks ago and had been there, long enough to want something to drink. He looked up when I came in. He had the expression I had learned to recognize over the past several weeks, the one that meant he had found something and was deciding how to say it. "Granddad," he said, "I think you should sit down." "I'm 72 years old," I said. "I sit down when I need to sit down." I sat down. Cody turned the laptop toward me. He had the Nevada Secretary of State Business Registry open on one side of the screen and a UC Filings database on the other. He walked me through it the way he always walked me through his findings, methodically, starting with what he had searched and ending with what he had found, so that I could follow the logic rather than just accept the conclusion. Tristan Hall was still listed as the registered agent for an active LLC in Nevada. Not under his name directly, but the registered agent address connected back to a service company that Cody had cross-referenced against a separate UCC filing from 14 months ago. And that filing listed Tristan Hall by name as the responsible party for a commercial agreement. The LLC itself was listed as active and in good standing. It had a contract with an American client for ongoing financial consulting services, and the contract had a renewal clause requiring personal signature from the registered agent. The renewal deadline, Cody said, is in 11 days. If Tristan does not appear in person to sign the updated agreement, The client has the right to terminate and recover a performance deposit. He pointed to a figure on the screen. 360元 ling ling ling. I looked at the number. Then I looked at my grandson, who was 18 years old and studying computer science at Arizona State University, and who had found this information through public registries and open databases. Because I had raised a daughter who taught her son that the most important skill in any situation is knowing how to read carefully. Does Watts know? I asked. I sent him the filing numbers an hour ago. Cody said he would start working it immediately. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. A man who had walked away from $800,000 was not going to walk away from $340,000. Not if he believed he could still reach it. And a man who had kept his American phone number active, who had left an American debit card paying for his girlfriend's storage unit, who had left a printed bank statement in a box in his own closet, had not fully committed to disappearing. He had committed to relocating while keeping enough threads attached to pole when the time felt right. The time was not going to feel right. But he did not know that yet. 2 days passed. On the second evening, I was at my workbench finishing the Steinbeck when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. Not unknown, just a number I had never saved. I looked at it for a moment and answered. "What did you do?" The voice on the other end was Tristan Hall's, and the fact that those 4 words contained no question mark told me everything I needed to know about the condition he was in. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, something stripped of its usual smooth management. "What did you do to my accounts? Who gave you the right to do any of this?" He was not asking. He was generating noise the way people generate noise. When the thing they have arranged very carefully has begun coming apart faster than they can assess the damage. I said nothing. I listened to him breathe. I counted not from any strategy I had read somewhere, but because 37 years in a classroom had taught me that the most powerful thing a person can do when someone else is losing composure is simply wait. Students who were certain I had not noticed something would always, given enough silence, tell me exactly what I had noticed. Tristan spoke again louder. "I'm telling you right now, you have no idea what you are dealing with. That was a legitimate business structure, and you have no legal standing to touch those accounts. My lawyer is going to take this apart piece by piece, and you are going to end up with nothing. You understand me? Nothing." The Palo Verde in the backyard was dark against the evening sky. The Steinbeck sat open on my workbench with its spine nearly repaired. 17 years of water damage almost corrected. The text still perfectly legible underneath. 3 seconds. I counted them. Then I said in the tone I once used to redirect a classroom that had gotten away from itself, calm and even and carrying just enough weight to be unmistakable. "Good afternoon, Tristan. I have been expecting your call." He went quiet. Not the quiet of someone who has decided to listen. The quiet of someone who has just understood that the ground they were standing on is not where they thought it was. I had pressed the record function on my phone before I answered. Arizona Revised Statutes Section 13 to 305. One-party consent. The recording was legal from the moment I picked up the call, and I was the party who had consented. I had also set the phone on my workbench so that my hands were free. There was something clarifying about that. Tristan was going to do most of the work in this conversation. I just needed to let him. "What do you mean you were expecting my call?" he said. The smoothness was trying to return to his voice. I could hear the effort it cost him. 9 years of watching Tristan Hall manage rooms had given me a detailed understanding of what he sounded like when he was performing. Confidence versus what he sounded like when he actually had it. This was the performance. The foundation underneath it was hollow in a way that a man with 37 years of listening to people speak could hear clearly. "I mean, I was expecting your call," I said. "Would you like to continue, or would you prefer to take a moment?" "I do not need a moment," he reset himself. I could almost hear the adjustment. "Russell, listen to me. This situation has gotten out of hand. I understand there are concerns, and I want to resolve this reasonably like adults." He paused to let the word adults land with whatever weight he intended. "I can make $200,000 available to you. Cash quickly. No additional legal involvement. You withdraw the complaint, and this is finished." There it was. I looked at the Steinbeck on my workbench. I looked at the phone. Its small red recording indicator visible in the low workshop light. I said, "Tell me more about that." And Tristan Hall, who had spent 2 years planning the careful dismantling of everything I had built over 37 years of teaching, began to talk. He talked for 11 minutes. I know because I checked the recording afterward. He described the 200,000 as money he could access from accounts that are still flexible. He used the word flexible twice, which I noted because it is the kind of word someone chooses when they do not want to say where the money actually is. Then, in a moment that would later cause Virginia Perez to set down her coffee cup and look at the ceiling for a full 4 seconds before responding, he said, "There is more in B's. The account there has not been touched. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that the money can come back. Most of it can come back, but not if you keep pushing. Because once federal attention comes into this, the channels close and nobody gets anything." I said I understand, which I did completely. He interpreted that as progress. His voice shifted again, warming into the register I recognized from 9 years of holiday dinners and Sunday afternoon conversations on my porch. The register that said, "I am reasonable, and you are being reasonable, and we are two intelligent people solving a problem together." It was in its way an impressive instrument. I had simply had long enough to understand what it was an instrument for. "So we have an agreement," he said. I did not say that, I said. Another silence, shorter this time, and harder. "Russell, I heard everything you said, Tristan. I want you to know that." He recognized something in that sentence. I could hear the recognition arrive. The way a classroom goes still at exactly the wrong moment for the student who has been talking. He said, "Are you recording this? I am in Arizona." I said, "You know how Arizona law works. You lived here for 9 years. He said several things after that which I will not reproduce because they were loud and not particularly informative, beyond confirming what I already knew about the condition he was in. Then the call ended. I picked up the phone, stopped the recording, and sat in my workshop for a moment in the particular quiet that follows something that has gone exactly as it needed to go. I called Virginia Perez at 8 the next morning and played her the recording. She listened without interrupting. When it finished, she said nothing for 4 seconds, which, as I have mentioned, is a significant pause for a woman who charges by the hour and does not waste either. "He named the account location himself," she said. "Voluntarily on a recorded call during what he apparently intended to be a negotiation." She set her coffee down. I heard it. "Russell, this is not just evidence. This is a confession of concealment. Wire fraud through international channels falls under federal jurisdiction. I am sending this to the FBI today with a full case summary." "How long before they respond?" I asked. "That depends on their current caseload, but a recorded admission naming an offshore account connected to an existing civil fraud filing with supporting documentation is not something that goes to the bottom of a pile." She paused again. "Tristan understood he made a mistake the moment you told him you were in Arizona. The problem for him is that understanding the mistake and undoing it are not the same thing." I thought about that on the drive home. Harlan Watts called me 4 days later. He had been tracking the Puerto Vallarta location through the methods available to a licensed investigator operating within the law. And what he told me was not what I wanted to hear, though it was not surprising. "He moved," Watts said, "checked out of the hotel 2 days after your phone call. I have a credit card transaction placing him in Guadalajara the following morning, and then nothing." The card went dark. He sounded less troubled by this than I was, which told me he had more to say. "He is in the wind for now, but a man with active accounts does not stay in the wind. He has to surface to protect what is his." We wait. 11 days passed in the way that difficult days pass when you have done everything you can do for the moment and the next move belongs to someone else. I fished the Salt River on 2 of those mornings. I finished the Steinbeck on a Wednesday afternoon and set it on the shelf where it belonged. I had dinner with Carol twice, and both times she seemed incrementally more like herself, which is to say more like me, which some people would not consider a compliment, but which I did. On the 12th day, Virginia Perez called me at mid-morning. "The FBI responded," she said. "Agent Clark Medina, out of the Phoenix field office. They are treating this as a wire fraud case with international dimensions. They are formally interested." A pause. "But Medina said something when I spoke with him that I think you need to hear directly." I waited. He said they already have a file on Nicole Ramirez Perez, said carefully, not connected to Tristan, independent of this case, something that predates your complaint by approximately 14 months. I sat down on the stool at my workbench and looked at the empty shelf where the Steinbeck had been. I asked Perez what was in the file. She said Medina had not specified, and she had not pressed. Because when a federal agent volunteers that a file exists, the appropriate response is patience rather than interrogation. He would share what he was authorized to share at the time he was authorized to share it. I respected that logic. I was not sure I was comfortable with it, but I respected it. The answer came 9 days later when Perez called and asked me to come to her office. Not a phone summary, an in-person meeting. I drove to the office on Thomas Road and sat across from her at the desk where we had spent a considerable portion of the past several months, and she told me what Agent Medina had told her. Nicole Ramirez had not arrived in Tristan's life by accident. 14 months before he disappeared, she had been briefly investigated in connection with a separate securities matter involving a now-dissolved investment advisory firm in Scottsdale. The investigation had not resulted in charges, but the file existed, and what it contained was more useful than charges. It contained a pattern, the same shell company structure, the same sequence transfer methodology, the same offshore destination routing that now appeared in Tristan's case. She did not learn the scheme from Tristan, Perez said, or not entirely. She brought architecture with her. I sat with that for a moment. A 3-4-year-old woman, who had been investigated once already for the same type of fraud, who had then inserted herself into the life of a financial consultant with an existing client list, and an elderly father-in-law with a pension fund, and who had an HR brain, independent offshore network already partially in place. I thought about the way I had characterized her in my mind over the past months, a passenger, an opportunist along for the ride. I had been reading that incorrectly, and I did not enjoy admitting it. But the first requirement of reading anything accurately is being willing to revise your interpretation when the text shows you something new. What does Medina want? I asked. He wants her, Perez said. Tristan is useful. Nicole Ramirez, given the existing file, and the new evidence, is potentially more useful. He reached out to her attorney last week. He offered a cooperation agreement, full disclosure of all account locations and transfer records in exchange for a reduced charge recommendation. And Perez allowed herself a very small, very controlled expression that on another face might have been called a smile. She took it 3 days ago. She is fully cooperating. I drove home on the 101 inches the mid-morning in traffic and thought about what it meant that Nicole Ramirez, who had helped build the mechanism that took $800,000 from a retired schoolteacher in Scottsdale, had decided within 48 hours of being approached that the most sensible path available to her was to dismantle that mechanism in front of federal agents. It meant she was at bottom a practical person, and practical people, when the calculation shifts, shift with it. There was nothing personal in that. It was simply arithmetic. Within the following week, Medina had account documentation covering 2 offshore locations, a bank in Baez that Tristan had named himself on the recorded call, and a second account in the Cayman Islands that only Nicole had known to Nama. The combined balance across both accounts at the time the documentation was submitted was $612,000. Not $800,000, not yet, but it was a number with a legal handle on it now, and a handle is where you begin. While that was developing, the civil case continued its own parallel movement. Virginia Perez had described the process to me once as 2 trains on separate tracks heading for the same station, and I had found that a reasonably accurate description. The federal criminal track moved faster now. The civil track moved steadily. The Maricopa County Superior Court issued its judgment on the frozen corporate accounts. $127,400 seized from the 2 shell LLCs Cody had identified through the Nevada registry was ordered transferred to me as partial satisfaction of the civil fraud judgment. I sat in Perez's office and listened to her explain the disbursement timeline, and I thought about the legal pad on my workbench with its 2 columns. The right column was no longer empty. It had a number in it, a real one, with a transfer order attached. The same week, Perez received a call from an attorney in Tucson representing Patricia Hall. Tristan's mother, it appeared, had been advised by her own counsel that her position as a third-party defendant in an active civil fraud case was not a position she wanted to maintain. The BMW X5, a 2022 model that had been transferred to her name 23 days before her son's departure, was being voluntarily signed back. No argument, no counterclaim. She had apparently weighed the situation and found it clarifying. The vehicle went to auction through the court-administered sale process. The net proceeds came to $51,200. I added that to the right column. The total stood at $178. $600 returned against the $800,000 that had left. I wrote the difference on a separate line. $621,400 still outstanding. I underlined it not because I needed the reminder, but because I found there was something useful about looking directly at what remained rather than only at what had been recovered. Carol came to dinner that Saturday evening. She had continued going through the house on Hayden Road systematically, and she had moved enough of her own things out that the house felt like a place she was leaving rather than a place she lived. That was not a small thing. That was her choosing the harder and more accurate interpretation of what the house had become, rather than the comfortable one. She looked at my legal pad on the kitchen table. She looked at both columns. "It is moving," she said. "It is moving," I agreed. Harlan Watts called me the following morning. He had been quiet for 8 days, which in my experience meant he was working rather than reporting. When Watts went quiet, something was resolving. "I have him," he said. "I waited for the geography." "Miami," Watts said. "He checked into a hotel near the airport 2 days ago under a name that took me a while to connect, but the face is on a security camera image I was able to obtain through a legitimate records request from a business contact." He paused. "Russell, he has a bag with him, not luggage for a hotel stay. Travel luggage." I looked out the kitchen window at the Palo Verde, which was in full yellow bloom now in the warm spring air. "Is he booked on something?" I asked. "That I cannot confirm through legal channels," Watts said. "But there is one international departure hub accessible from where he is staying. And the timing of what you told me about the Blees account and the fact that he is in Miami rather than any other city in this country suggests a direction." A man who had named a Blees account on a recorded phone call, who knew that account was now in federal view, who had moved from Mexico to an American city with an international airport and was carrying travel luggage. I called Perez. Then I called Medina's number, which Perez had given me 2 weeks earlier for exactly the category of information I was now holding. Medina picked up on the second ring. I told Medina everything Watts had given me: the hotel near the Miami airport, the travel bag, the timing relative to the Blees account disclosure. I kept it factual and brief because Medina was a federal agent with a file already open, and he did not need me to draw conclusions for him. I gave him the facts and let him read between the lines himself. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Mr. Fleming, I want you to stay by your phone this evening." I stayed by my phone. I went to bed at 10:00 because I am 72 years old, and I have learned that exhausted men make poor decisions and worse observers. And I had a feeling the next 12 to 24 hours were going to require me to be a good observer. I slept in the way you sleep when something large is in motion, and there is nothing left for you to do but wait for it to finish moving. My phone rang at 7:14 the morning. I was already up. I'd made coffee, and I had driven out to the Salt River in the early gray light before the heat arrived, which is the only civilized time to be on that water in late spring. I was standing at the edge, fly rod in hand, watching the current move around a submerged rock, the way I had watched it move 100 times before, when the phone in my vest pocket buzzed. "Clark, Medina." I set the rod against my shoulder and answered. "Mr. Fleming," he said. Tristan Hall was taken into federal custody at Miami International Airport at 5:47 this morning. A brief pause, the kind that precedes something that has weight to it. He was at the International Departures Terminal. He had a one-way ticket to Blees City in his jacket pocket. I looked at the river. The current moved the way it always moved. Patient and entirely indifferent to the particular arrangements of human beings on its banks. "What are the charges?" I asked, though Perez had already walked me through what federal charges would look like if this moment arrived. "Wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. Money laundering under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956. Securities fraud under 15 U.S.C. Section 78J. Medina's voice had the flat practice quality of a man who had read charges into a phone before and understood that the person on the other end needed them, stated plainly. "He will be transported to Arizona for formal arraignment in federal district court." That process takes several days, but it is in motion. I said, "Thank you, Agent Medina. Thank your grandson." Medina said, "The Nevada registry filing is what put us on the right track. Without a documented connection to active domestic business interests, we would have been working with considerably less to act on. The kid did good work. I stood on the bank for another minute after the call ended. The rod was still in my hand. I had not cast once that morning, and I did not cast then either. I just looked at the water. There is a particular silence that a classroom reaches when something has concluded, not ended abruptly, but concluded the way a lesson concludes, when the student has finally understood the thing you have been working toward together. Even if the student in this case was a 4-1-year-old man in handcuffs, at an airport gate, with a one-way ticket in his pocket. I said it out loud to the river and the mosquito and the early morning air that did not care what I said. I taught children to read between the lines. Did you really think you could fool the teacher? It sounded better spoken than it would have in a text message. Most things do. I called Cody on the drive back. He answered on the third ring, still half asleep, which reminded me that 1-8-year-old students at ASU do not necessarily share the morning schedule of retired school teachers. I told him what Medina had told me. There was a pause, and then I heard him exhale slowly. "Okay," he said. The way he said it told me more than a longer sentence would have. That single word carried the weight of every late night he had spent in front of a laptop screen working through public registries, UCCC filings, and corporate records in Nevada and Florida and Arizona. Every hour he had spent on something that mattered, applied to something real. Medina said to thank you. I told him he doesn't have to do that. No, I said he doesn't. He did it anyway. Virginia Perez called me before I reached home. The civil case had not stopped moving simply because the criminal track had accelerated. She informed me that the Maricopa County Superior Court had issued a formal order activating the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty request to BIES. The MLAT mechanism was a slow instrument under normal circumstances, but an instrument with federal criminal charges attached to it moved at a different pace. The court was requesting full account documentation and cooperative asset transfer from the Blaine Financial Institution. The estimated timeline for the initial response was 2 to 4 weeks. That is faster than I expected. I said federal charges have a way of clarifying timelines. Perez said the BIES account is now connected to an active federal criminal prosecution. That changes the conversation considerably. I poured the remainder of my coffee into the kitchen sink and rinsed the cup. I looked at the legal pad on the table with its 2 columns. The right column had $178,600 inches it. The left column still showed $800,000, but the gap between those numbers now had a federal arrest. 2 offshore account disclosures from a cooperating witness. An active MLAT order and a one-way ticket to BIES that never got used attached to it. That afternoon my phone showed a call from a number I did not recognize with a 602 area code. I answered. A man identified himself as Douglas Frey, attorney at law, representing Tristan Hall in the civil matter pending in Maricopa County. His voice had the careful, measured quality of someone who has been asked to make a call he would personally have advised against but is making professionally. Mr. Fleming, he said. My client has authorized me to communicate that he is prepared to discuss a full resolution of the civil matter, a complete settlement. I'm listening, I said. Frey paused. He is prepared to offer $894.00 total settlement, covering the original principal acreage interest under Arizona Revised Statute Section 44-1201, and documented legal costs, full acknowledgement of liability, structured disbursement over 60 days. I looked at the legal pad. I looked at both columns. Then I looked at the blank space below them where I had written and underlined the outstanding balance. $894,000, not $800,000, more than $800,000. Every dollar he had taken, plus the interest on the time it had been gone, plus the cost of every hour Virginia Perez had spent getting it back. I said I will have my attorney contact you by end of business tomorrow. Virginia Perez reviewed the settlement offer that evening and called me the following morning to say what I had already understood but appreciated hearing from someone who specialized in the language of these things. The offer was legitimate, the structure was enforceable, and the number reflected exactly what Arizona law allowed a court to award under the fraud statutes. Tristan's attorney had done the arithmetic correctly, which told me that Tristan, sitting in federal custody with 3 separate charges against him, had finally understood that the arithmetic was the only argument left. Perez recommended acceptance. I authorized her to proceed. The settlement agreement was signed 3 weeks later at the Maricopa County Courthouse. I did not attend in person. Perez handled it, which is what I pay her for and what she is very good at. She called me from the parking lot afterward and read me the key language from the signature page. I listened to her read it on the phone while sitting in my workshop, and when she finished I said thank you, and we said goodbye, and I sat there for another 2 minutes before I moved. The first disbursement arrived 31 days after signing. $412,000 transferred from the Blesian account following the completed MIL-AT process. The number appeared on my bank account screen the way numbers appear without ceremony or commentary, just digits arranged in an order that represented something I had spent 7 months working to make real. The second disbursement followed 11 days after that, $189,000 from the Cayman account that Nicole Ramirez had named in her cooperation agreement with the FBI. The final disbursement came from the liquidation of the remaining LLC assets, proceeds distributed through the court. The total when the last transfer cleared was $894,500. I printed the final account statement and set it on my workbench next to the legal pad with the 2 columns. I looked at both of them. Then I put the legal pad in the drawer, because it had done its job. And I do not keep tools out after the work is finished. The criminal proceedings moved on their own schedule, which is to say slowly, and then suddenly Tristan Hall entered a plea agreement with the federal prosecutor roughly 6 weeks after his arraignment. 4 years in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The agreement required full cooperation with the civil recovery process, which he had already provided by signing the settlement and a formal acknowledgement of guilt on all 3 charges. His attorney had negotiated down from what the original charge exposure would have carried, which I understand is how federal plea agreements work. He would serve the 4 years. Then he would spend 3 years with a federal officer checking in on him regularly, which struck me as a reasonable arrangement for a man who had spent 9 years presenting himself as someone whose judgment could be trusted. Nicole Ramirez received her outcome 2 weeks after Tristan's plea was finalized. 18 months of probation, no custody. A fine of $45,000 to be paid within 12 months. She had cooperated fully and quickly, and the cooperation agreement reflected that. I did not feel warmly about the outcome, but I understood it. She had been useful to the federal case in ways that had directly resulted in the Cayman account being identified and recovered. That is the arithmetic of cooperation agreements. The math is transactional and not particularly satisfying, but it works. I heard about her reaction to the sentencing from Perez, who had been present. Nicole Ramirez sat very still through the judge's statement. Not the stillness of someone at peace, but the stillness of someone who has decided that visible emotion is a liability she cannot afford. When it was over, she said something brief to her attorney and walked out without looking at the gallery. Practical to the last, I thought. At least she was consistent. Carol came over the evening after the final settlement disbursement cleared. She had filed for divorce from Tristan the previous month, and the process was moving efficiently, aided considerably by the fact that there was no jointly held marital property to dispute Tristan having transferred or liquidated everything before his departure. The settlement funds were mine. The LLC assets had been legally mine since the civil judgment. There was nothing for him to claim. His attorney apparently understood this and had not attempted to complicate it. She sat at my kitchen table and looked at the account statement I had printed. She looked at the number at the bottom. She did not say anything for a moment. "Dad," she said finally. Her voice had the particular quality it carries when she is not performing steadiness but actually has it. The voice she uses when she means what she says without needing to dress it up. "You did this. We did this." I said, "You brought me the bank statement with Nicole's name on it. Without that document, Perez could not have named her in the civil filing, and the FBI would not have had the connection they needed to make the cooperation agreement worth her while." Carol looked at the table. "I found it because I was finally willing to look. That is the harder half," I said. "Finding something is easier than deciding to look." Cody arrived an hour later. He had driven from the ASU campus, and he came in the way he usually comes in, without particular announcement, going directly to the kitchen and opening the refrigerator with the ease of someone who has been doing that in my house since he was 5 years old. I handed him a bottle of water. He took it and leaned against the counter. Carol left at 9 and Cody stayed. We drove out to the Salt River the following morning before the heat arrived, while the sky above the Mosket was still the pale gold it gets just after sunrise. We stood on the bank in comfortable silence, the way you can stand in silence with someone when the silence does not need to be filled. I cast once and watched the line unroll across the water in the clean arc that took me 20 years to learn how to make consistently. After a while, I said, "You know what you did was the right thing. Not for me, for yourself." He looked at the river. "I just found public records." He said anyone could have done that. Anyone could have. I said, "You did." He was quiet for a moment, watching the current. Then he said, "I read between the lines. Grandpa, you taught me how." I looked at the water moving around the submerged rock, patient and indifferent and entirely dependable the way water is when it has been running over the same ground long enough to know exactly where it is going. The money came back every dollar, plus the cost of the time it was gone. But standing on that bank in the early morning with my grandson beside me, I knew that the money was the smaller part of what had been recovered. What mattered more was that an 8-year-old kid had seen something wrong and had not looked away, had not waited for someone else to act, had sat down at a laptop and learned the terrain and done the work. I spent 37 years teaching children to read carefully, think clearly, and not accept the first explanation offered to them. Some lessons take, some do not. The ones that take are the reason you keep showing up. He was the reason I kept showing up. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to several stories there. You will find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video, or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose track of us, because this channel will soon cease to exist.